Back to the subject at hand. Let's talk about CoQ10 effectiveness. This is an article from the NCBI, National Center for Biotechnology Information. CoQ10 demonstrated a statistically significant fatigue alleviating effect as compared to the evaluated placebos. The effect was statistically significant, correlated with daily dose and treatment duration. So this was a, what's it called? A big study where they study other studies.
Meta-analysis.
That's
like
the one.
systematic review kind of thing.
Okay.
Top of the food chain.
Yes. And you say that because there's a whole lot of data. Is that why you call it that?
They use different criteria to pull together different studies that have already been done to help try to get some direction on a given
You can
outcome.
filter out some noise that can be in individual studies as well.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. That makes sense. So this is a meta-analysis. There's a lot of big fancy words being thrown around here.
Mm-hmm.
My understanding is that they're saying we looked at all these studies, and when we balanced them all out, we found that CoQ10 is effective. It does help reduce stress and stress markers. People that have pre-existing heart issues or things like that, it helped them as well. And the longer you're on it, the better. And that there was a correlation between the amount you take and the results. Am I summing up correctly what they're saying?
Yeah, I would say so. They definitely found more of a difference in patients that had diseases than in patients that were healthy, of course, and that makes total sense.
Okay.
And they did use different endpoints to get their results, which we can get into. That can be part of a flaw in this ultimately. But yeah, overall, the conclusion overall is positive.
Okay, so first of all, what is CoQ10?
CoQ10 is essentially the word coenzymes, CoEnzyme Q10,
right?
Is very similar to a vitamin, kind of another word for a vitamin. Basically, just means in a metabolic or in a chemical process that it's needed to help further it along. And CoQ10 in particular is involved in ATP production, which is cellular energy. And that occurs in your mitochondria, which is the
powerhouse of the cell.
Powerhouse of the cell.
High school biology for the win.
So that's I don't know if Dante has anything to add, but it's kind of the brushstroke of coenzyme Q10.
Okay, so it is an enzyme that is used in ATP production within the cell.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
All right, makes sense.
Yeah. The only other thing I would add is, in addition to the energy production, it's known as a kind of a powerful antioxidant, right?
Yes, great point. Yes.
And so we've heard of things like oxidative stress, which can damage lipids, DNA, cause a whole host of issues. That's where it's kind of also seen to kind of scavenge those,
damaged
reactive species.
Okay. That makes sense. That's cool. All right.
And I think another key thing is that it's found in higher concentrations in organs with a lot of mitochondria and with essentially that have a lot of energy demand.
Sure.
Your heart, number one, pumping all the time, can't stop, no time off. Your kidneys, always regenerating, always working. So those are two of the organs where you see a high concentration, high need for CoQ10, and where you see more effect when supplementing with CoQ10, because they obviously have that higher need and their deficiency is more well noticed and seen.
Okay, so that answers my next question, which is who is this for? Who is a good candidate for taking CoQ10?
I mean, the study looked at healthy individuals who just have fatigue, as kind of noted by a validated questionnaire, basically, and then people with obesity, MS, fibromyalgia. They've used it in individuals with polio, end-stage renal disease.
Wow.
Diagnosed chronic fatigue, which is obviously one step further, more complicated than just fatigue as validated by a questionnaire.
Yeah, I just feel tired a lot.
Sure. And then finally, there were individuals with breast cancer undergoing chemotherapy.
Okay.
So it seems like it's a good thing and a bad thing, kind of how wide-reaching the population.
I was going to say, those were all different studies within the meta-analysis. That's what you're talking about, all of those were different studies.
Yes.
Wow.
And I think one thing you hear very commonly with CoQ10 is the muscular energy, and you hear about it for athletic performance. They actually excluded those types of studies from from this, which I thought was interesting because
Yeah.
I thought, if they're looking or expecting to get a bump and show some significance, that would be one that, would have a really good chance of doing that. And they eliminated it because they wanted to stick to more chronic conditions versus dealing with performance and things like that. Not that there's anything wrong with that,
Okay.
but they really did want to stick to a more base level of people who have fatigue or who have chronic conditions. They have those two subgroups.
So what you're saying is it's useful for people who have chronic conditions, but in general, it's very useful for athletes as well. And we already knew that, but this is data showing it is very useful in people who have chronic conditions where fatigue is a factor.
Yes, it was done by a hospital.
Certainly,
So
yes.
yes, they're looking at.
Yeah, I think we'll kind of get to the more of our thoughts on what this meta-analysis really showed. But yeah, I think in general, yes, it can have a positive effect. Now, if this was something that had a whole host of side effects and came with risks inherently with CoQ10, I think we might be singing a different tune.
Sure.
I think we just, like a lot of things, we temper our expectations on what this can kind of do because fatigue is so challenging. I mean, for a lot of these people, they could have easily just been experiencing improvements in their condition versus what were they actually taking. It's very complicated, but again, it's something that has such low downside and it showed a marginal benefit. And so we're kind of like, hey, what the heck, right?
Cool. I mean, that makes sense.
Now, again, I hate to jump the gun, but it kind of felt like that's where we.
I mean, fatigue. It doesn't get a whole lot more broad than fatigue.
Yeah.
I mean, and there's so many reasons for it. So I'm with you for sure.
Yeah.
So talk about then. There are some issues with this study.
Yes.
What's the problem?
So the biggest things I would say are ones that they mentioned kind of in their discussion, which was noble of them.
Yeah.
There's notable variability or heterogeneity amongst the subjects.
Heterogeneity meaning not consistent.
Yes.
Okay.
And so it's hard to draw such a generalized conclusion if you're looking at such a broad population of people, males, females, some with just males, some with just females, some with this condition, some without this condition. It's just, when you're looking at that, heterogeneity doesn't automatically mean that we just throw this out the window and it's useless. It's just a limitation worth discussing.
But isn't that, I mean, it seems to me like that was kind of part of the idea, was they were trying to do it in a broad brush perspective.
Sure.
So they had to go wide and far reaching. But you're saying in terms of research, because you can't point to one specific thing and say that right there, this is what we're testing.
Sure.
It kind of becomes less useful overall.
Yes, it's more of just like hey, keep this in the back of your mind if somebody decides to read this and they expect a massive effect. But yes, you're right. That can easily be spun as a sort of a positive way to look at the research. But, it kind of just is what it is.
Yeah.
And another one would be the different fatigue questionnaires or the validated models that they used. So they sort of just pulled those results together in some sort of standardized way to get a result in terms of how much their fatigue improved over the course of their treatment. So ideally, you'd want something that's more uniform in that respect.
They really did all they could with what they had to work with. It does appear that way for sure.
Okay.
Now, to some of the different scales they used, and I think first thing is that anytime you're dealing with something that's placebo and that's random controlled trials, that is the standard.
Right.
But you're dealing with a subjective questionnaire. This is not, well, somebody gets a placebo and somebody gets the drug and then we measure their blood sugar.
Right.
Objectively.
Right.
Somebody gets the placebo, somebody gets the supplement, and then we measure how they say they feel over time. There's there can be a lot of bias there.
Yeah.
And I think when you look at the size, first thing that grabbed me was, there's 1,200 patients or so. They were still divided up within 13 studies. For a meta-analysis, not a whole lot.
So that's less than 100 people per study on average.
It's not as big as it can jump out and make you sound. But that's a flaw of a lot of, you're looking at nutritional supplements, that's kind of the realm that you live in, or small studies and flawed studies. And that doesn't mean that they don't work. It just means they don't have multi-billion-dollar drug companies.
Because that's really what it comes down to, right? There's not the money to support a 10,000 person trial.
Yes,
let alone then to do a meta-analysis of 10 of those, or 5 of those that now has 50,000 people.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah, so it seems as though they did do as good as they probably could have. Again, not that all of these sort of limitations have an additive effect to say all of this is 1 + 1 + 1 is why this is worthless. It's just kind of like, it's good to know.
Yeah.
And it's good to go into this stuff with an open mind. And it's also, as a more like generalized principle, just because meta-analyses are at the top of the food chain, if you're putting together 12 studies that are mediocre at best, it doesn't mean it doesn't make it a net
It's not
positive.
going to necessarily be better than the sum of its parts.
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Got it. All right.
They did a measurement of how they essentially averaged them out and did it's called a Hedges G measurement of how effective it is.
Yeah.
And essentially, if you get 0.2 small effect, 0.5 medium effect, 0.8 large effect, the average outcome was about 0.4. Or that was maybe just in the one.
No, that was just under 0.4.
That was just under point. Yeah, so just under 0.4.
Okay.
So closer to a medium effect and to a small effect. Significant, no downside. You know, again, by every measure of using the best studies they could find, significant, but not a 0.7, not a 0.6.
And like you said,
that's awesome.
Literally one person dropped out because of an adverse effect.
GI effect.
So yes,
out of several thousand, 1,200.
Yes, and so at the end of the day, if you have the means to do it,
Cool.
CoQ10 it's probably fine.
I like it.